Well, we're going to leave Iran for now and come a bit more down to earth, joined by the chair of Reform UK here in Bristol. That's Richard
Visick, yeah.
Visick. Hi, nice to see you, Richard.
Yeah, nice to see you as well, Tom.
And I wonder how seriously you in Reform take these most recent polls that indicate that if there was a general election tomorrow, you would have quite a comfortable 40 to 50 seat majority.
Yeah, it does look very plausible at the moment, and at the moment, just by going around looking at the various council elections throughout the country, it has been very positive, which also backs that story up as well. Obviously, it looks promising also in Wales and Scotland with the recent election in Hamilton, which just shows that Reform have done pretty well there to squeeze on the SNP, and also coming up not far behind Labour there. I mean, Reform is 26.5, SNP 29, 28, so 1% in it between the leading party Labour, so it's very near even Scotland, in a place you'd never consider it. In the Runcorn by-election recently, that was a safe Labour seat. Reform did win it, admittedly, but with a small majority, but that was still an incredible situation. So Reform is taking it seriously, and indeed Reform supporters are. And as you know, the better that Reform does, the more people will take Reform as a proper party to vote for that has a genuine chance of not just winning in the north, but also in Essex, Lincolnshire, in fact, throughout the country.
You had your chairman resign the other week. 3 days later, he rejoined again. It sounds a bit shambolic, doesn't it? A bit amateurish.
Well, every party's got its resignations. I mean, today we've had Newby, the lady, the Commissioner for Treasury, resign, and the Labour Party over the disability fiasco in terms of the amount they're cutting back on that. So every party, and that's the party that's been going for much longer than Reform. The Tories have got their various issues as well. So that's part of a growing party. But then it was constructive because Zia Youssef does resign. He comes back, he says he's very tired, and he takes on the role of policy, and indeed the situation with Doge looking at the councils, etc. So that was a fairly comfortable arrangement there. So it doesn't seem much damage at all, quite frankly.
So have you been involved in politics before?
No, I haven't.
So what's your background?
Me, I'm a lawyer. I have been involved in quietly campaigning, in the sense I take part in consultation papers for the government, in the UK government consultation papers. Anyone can take part in them. Not many people do take part, not paid or anything else. I'm a lawyer. But they do actually listen, believe it or not, and that's one of the things that Dave Cameron did help with, actually encouraging people to go down that road, and the government will actually look at consultation papers. So I cover a range of subjects, including family law as well, child maintenance system, various other areas of the economic policy.
So civil law, not criminal law?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So what is it about Reform that attracted you?
I think obviously one of the big attractions is it's a party that looks at the rights of the individual versus the state. The state has at times been, in order to protect the minority of, let's say, 5%, it really comes down so heavily on the 95% outside of that 5%. It's incredibly bureaucratic at the moment, the system, and whoever you are, whatever party you support, you quite often get a utility bill that's completely wrong, or a tax demand that's wrong. Then you try and ring up the tax office and it takes ages to get through. And then if you, let's say, owe them money, you've got to pay them straight away. If you then are owed money back, they take weeks to pay you back, with many government institutions, including the council. So I think that the problem at the moment is that you've got the state versus the individual. There needs to be more protection for the individual.
Well, hang on, because Reform are interested in spending less on government and taxing less, etc. So that's actually going to just exacerbate that, isn't it? But it's going to be less money for Bristol City Council, for example, or HMRC to spend on people in call centres to help out people who owe tax or council tax or whatever.
Well, there's a few ways of dealing with them. For a start, let's say with tax, so everyone who's paying tax up to 20,000 would be completely exempt on personal taxation. So that's a whole layer of bureaucracy and phone calls to the tax office that don't need to be made in the first place. And that again accords with various other parties, including the Workers' Party, for example, and others that see there's a benefit in actually giving less bureaucracy to people at that end of income. Helps with the poverty trap, indeed, in terms of benefits and social security payments as well. So that will help with the queues, etc. So there can be a situation where you can be less interventionist in certain individual rights and more intervention. In fact, if we look at Reform in some areas, they want to intervene more in government. For example, whether it's even thinking about the idea of, let's say, going back with coal furnaces in Wales and these steelworks. So there's an interventionist government in some ways as well, but also free market, many others as well.
What about some of the big hot-button issues that Reform is known for, that Nigel Farage is known for, about Brexit? Do you think there's actually been a Brexit?
Well, I think a lot of reform supporters argue there haven't been, because Britain's still a member of the European Convention of Human Rights, is still on the Council of Europe, and obviously it's got the Human Rights Act, which brings that into force within the rules of English law. So obviously reform wants that to be changed by effectively coming out of the ECHR, and indeed giving notice to the Secretary of the Council of Europe to come out of the arrangements in terms of the human rights.
Most of human rights, isn't that a positive thing? That's about the only bit of law I can think of that I really like is human rights.
I think there's a lot to be said with human rights, and obviously there's an argument to say, should there be a human rights code brought into this country just specifically for England, because as you know, we don't have a constitution in this country, and that is something that can be looked at. But at the moment, as you know, the ECHR debate centres quite a lot with immigration, and that's obviously one of the problems we've got at the moment, where people are genuinely worried. When I go knocking on the doorsteps with other colleagues, it's quite clear that people have had enough about illegal immigration. They're fed up. It's a non-negotiable issue, and this unfortunately is the only way to come out, because otherwise, if we were trying to renegotiate the European Court, the ECHR, you need the actual agreement of all the other countries involved. Fun enough, even the EU is not a member of the ECHR at the moment as we speak, so it just gives you what some of the complexities of the situation.
So have we left the European Union or not? Because there's quite a lot of people who are saying, well, actually it doesn't seem like much has changed at all.
Well, I think in practice we have in certain legal ways, but not fully. It looks like a sort of half-finished story to most people, and indeed that probably is the case. At the moment, when you've got a situation when you cannot remove asylum seekers that easily from this country, you need to go through to be able to combat any applications under human rights. So we aren't fully within a situation where we can say that we've left the EU completely.
Is assisted dying a human right?
Well, Reform has quite an open policy in terms of, Nigel Farage basically is someone who opposes the euthanasia or assisted dying, and one of the reasons, fun enough, is because the ECHR, if that suddenly could start legislating beyond, we have judge-based rules that go beyond the framework of anything that's been passed today. So that's one area. But he did give a free vote to his other members in Parliament on that subject. And
what do you think?
It's something that I must say everyone I speak to, and I'm pretty open-minded about it, from a religious perspective, every soul has a value. Obviously, I struggle with the point that even Nigel Farage made, which is a good one. You can have a situation where we're going now on to the issue of abortions with 22, up to 24, it can be abortions, yet if someone's rushed through premature at 22 weeks, they are sort of alive, aren't they? So it is a really difficult one, and I must say I can't give an exact decision in my own mind, because it's something I can see both points of view on that.
Well, and when you've just brought up abortion there, that's a bit of a hot one this week, isn't it, as well, because they're now saying that there won't be criminal prosecutions of women that abort children right up to the time of birth. Well, it's almost like the moment of birth. Is it at the moment of birth that an embryo suddenly becomes a person, and you can be done for murder, or not before? It just seems to me that the envelope has been being pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed all this time, and not necessarily in a very, shall we say, human rights direction. An embryo is a human, and does it have no rights?
Well, as you say, that there's a lot of commentary on both sides on that, and a very, very hard one to make a decision. And then to my mind, it would be, this is on a private basis in these matters, they should be left as matters to referendum. I know referenda can cause problems, but it's something that's personal to everyone, so it's very hard for me to make a judgment on that myself. Obviously, I can see the arguments, but obviously it's a really tough one.
So, it sounds to me like Reform UK is already shifting away from people voting with their conscience.
Well, I think there's a lot of people that obviously have very strong views in terms of their conscience and the role of the state, and indeed how the UK reacts with its place in the world, obviously.
To me, it's a massively important business. Abortion is, a horrendous and horrific thing that can actually have a really terrible effect, psychological effect on a woman to have an abortion, and difficult sometimes to think, well, maybe you should think twice about casual sex before you have the abortion, rather than just leave it to the last minute. There's such a lot of kind of almost like selling of this idea of, sex is just for fun, it's not for commitment and marriage. Martin, what do you make of this decision this week? Were you surprised to see that? Is it something you approve of or not?
Well, I'm probably largely pro-abortion, although I recognise there are different difficulties.
Pro-abortion?
I'm not in favour of it being illegal, Tony. Okay? All right? I don't think that does any good.
Isn't it better to have the child and have it adopted and that sort of thing?
No, I don't. I think in actual fact, those who want to say that, and of course the Catholic Church says that, and we've got a situation where we've said to people that, and I believe that Reform are on side with this, that we shouldn't have a two-child benefit cap limit. I totally disagree with that, and Reform come out on that line. I'm with them on that one, but you can't say...
everyone in this room, and we do happen to all be men, but we were all those little fetuses once upon a time, weren't we?
All right, well, I'm afraid this is something that was sorted out in this...
I'm quite glad that nobody squashed Martin out, when he was a little... Anyways, so we're...
All right, well, you asked me what I think, I've told you.
Okay.
I'm in favour of regulated abortion. I'm in favour of regulated boozing.
Up until death.
And regulated taking of drugs.
Up until the moment of birth? Up until the moment of birth?
No, the argument for the late abortions is that some of those are actually the most extreme cases where, for example, people have been raped by a relative. Yeah? So in other words, I don't think having hard and fast rules about this, any of these things, is sensible. Medical decisions are often 50-50 decisions for anything. And so we were talking about assisted dying earlier, and we've had doctors come in on this show, and they're saying, well, in actual fact, in reality, when we're making decisions in an extreme, extreme situations, it's very difficult to say what exactly is the right thing to do.
Well, abortion up until
we need
birth
to give people some space
and
to make
assisted dying have both been legalised by this government. The assisted dying by 23 votes earlier on today.
It was a free vote, Tony, so it wasn't the government.
But Richard, what about migrants? Because this, of course, is another massive one. We had a big promise, didn't we, by Sir Keir Starmer? He was going to stop the boats. We had a big promise by Rishi Sunak. Boris, all these people have said they're going to stop the boats. None of them have.
Well, I'll tell you a little story. Yesterday when I woke up, I had this dream, and I suddenly woke up, and the dream, I'll tell you that you'll understand why this is relevant. I woke up, and I was actually on a beach watching, in England, suddenly a load of land appear, and houses being built on it. And then suddenly, I would turn around, and in this dream, I was surrounded by, literally, where I live, to loads of people in the house. So effectively I was giving accommodation to these migrants. And obviously I'm not paranoid, I'm very sympathetic to all races in the world. I'm not racist, as Reform people are very sympathetic to other races and not racist. And basically I was wondering, what does this tell me? And of course I suddenly thought, well, we've got the situation, for example, in Iran, where Israel's talking about regime change. We've got various struggles in the world. I sometimes wonder there could be a much, much bigger influx of immigrants than anything we've actually seen so far, and hence the dream could have been, like, are they going to end up building islands opposite where we are of people to be accommodated, etc., suddenly being asked to share with roofs. Now obviously that's an extreme situation, and I hope to God that doesn't happen to the world, but the situation that people are really worried, they're already incredibly worried, and I think we've got to boiling point about it, and that's why Reform is taking such a tough stance on it. People believe Reform, as it's not been in power during this massive build-up of immigration and illegal in this country.
But it's also, much of it is legal, isn't it?
Well,
in fact, most of it, by far, there's something like 95% of migration is legal migration with visas, work visas.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, I think when you speak to people, the thing they're particularly concerned is illegal migration, because they don't know what's happening. It could just, there's no limit on it. You even get figures that currently in this country, there's 6 million illegal immigrants, and we just don't know how many there are. So there is very, very strong feelings. But all I can say is, when I knock on doorsteps, well, I know by just talking to people, they've just had enough, and they literally just can't take any more. And the economy isn't delivering for them. It's not a great time in the world. So they do want to see the end of this.
Martin, what do you think? Well, is it time we've had enough of migration?
Well, I think the problem is very serious, because the world economy and the geopolitical situation is very serious. So, for example, we participated in the right to protect the people of Libya. The RAF bombed the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group to power, whose headquarters have been in Manchester since the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher invited all the Muslims to come.
These illegal migrants are being brought over by organised criminal gangs.
Yes.
Those boats are from Germany, they're not from Libya.
No, but I'm just talking about illegal immigration in general. Okay? So loads of people ended up coming through Libya into Italy, right? The Italians will say, well, we don't want them. Perhaps because it was the RAF that used Akrotiri base to knock down Gaddafi, perhaps you should take some of them instead of us taking them all. Now, there is going to be a big problem if for example, all these Palestinians that the Israelis want to get rid of, where do you think they might come? Since everybody learns English in school over the whole world, which gives us a great advantage in terms of international, selling things to people because they always speak our language. So what I would say about this is people need to take a deep breath and look at it rationally. The economic migrants is a different question. Let's just talk about the illegal
Why
ones.
hasn't your party stopped it like they said they would? They were elected.
Because
one of their main planks, actually, he had I think it was 5 pledges he made. One of them, Keir Starmer, a year ago, was to stop the boats. Actually, what's happened is they've increased, and there's even more illegal migrants risking their lives by benefiting organised crime coming across the Channel.
There's more people coming because the situation both globally, both in terms of war and in terms of the economy, is dire for all reasons we could go into. The point, what should happen, in my view, if you want my view about this, what should be happening about people getting boats to come across the Channel is we should be sending people over the Channel to talk to all these people, decide who can come, because some of them are genuine asylum seekers under the existing rules, and then you don't have them getting into a boat, you put them on the ferry.
But organised crime is not going to take... Organised crime is not going to take any notice of that. They're just going to move around you. They're going to laugh at you. They'll point at you. And then they'll bring another boatload over.
The people concerned, Tony, don't have to speak to an organised crime person. They can speak to an immigration officer from this country. And there's no need to go to organised crime. Yeah? Now, that does mean that you've got to accept that some of them are going to come. Now, of course, what's happened previously with the Tory regime was they're going to make it so difficult that people will stop coming. I have to tell you, that is not going to happen. The push factors in the world at large, look what's happened in Syria. We've now got an Al-Qaeda government in Syria, which we helped put in power. Our special forces were very involved in all of that, as they've been involved in Al-Qaeda all the way, which a lot of Reform voters fail to understand, like most people in this country. And of course, the Syrians, millions of them who fled from the evil Assad regime, guess what? They don't want to go back to live under Al-Qaeda.
Let's hear, Richard, what do you make of these arguments that actually this is wars, it's not organised crime causing this?
Well, just to give an example of, I think at the moment, the current cost of coming across the Channel in one of these sort of boats at the moment is £2,000. So where are these people going to get this £2,000? How do they pay? They're all on mobile phones. And I do actually agree with Martin in the sense that talking to these people, though for different reasons, if they were persuaded that coming here isn't the solution because they're not welcome, things are not going to go right, they will know very quickly because they are looking at their mobile phones. So once things start happening here where they're stopped from coming or told they can't come, they will realise they're not welcome and they can start giving up on the idea. And that £2,000, interestingly, since the year 2002, is the largest discount on people coming over at the moment. So that's a low price, £2,000. So God knows what that price would be before. And then it begs the question, where are they getting this money to pay to come across? And Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, made the point recently that you look at people coming right the way across to Tunisia, coming across to Italy, and they've come all the way from the Middle East. They're going through several countries, several borders. This is organised crime in the sense of getting people across the borders. It involves a lot of organisation. It's going on. So it just shows, in her view, which I think makes sense, that they have to use all the various organs of state, the different bodies, to try and deal with this. So it's not just the police or the frontier people. It's looking at it as a whole organised situation. But at the end of the day, the resource of states like Italy or the UK is far larger than these people. And in the end, it should be possible to stop what's happening.
Well, it certainly should. Well, we shall see. Maybe Reform will get a chance to sort of line up, like everyone else has been lining up, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, to see if they can actually do anything about this. And related to a lot of this, although I think Martin doesn't really agree that it's related, is the housing crisis. Of course, if you've got 750,000 migrants coming in, legal and illegal, each year, apparently it's now going down a bit, maybe because Britain's economy isn't quite so attractive for people coming in with work visas. Certainly the student visas are very high levels, but we have a housing crisis, don't we? We certainly do here in Bristol. We were discussing last week the figures and a bit of a confrontation up on the Downs, although it wasn't as much of a confrontation as some people were suggesting it would be, with local residents saying the council is doing absolutely nothing about the now roughly 200 people living on the Downs, literally by the side of the road up there in caravans, because the housing in Bristol, the housing system in Bristol is broken. Poor people, homeless people are not being housed, and so they're realising, I'm not going to go sitting in a shop doorway. I'm going to pay a few £100s to get myself a caravan, so at least I can have a reasonably civilised life. But the fact is they're up on the Downs, and the council haven't found anywhere else for them to go.
Well, we did have a meeting earlier in the week with Tony Nelson, who's the Protect the Downs chair. We've also got a reform person sitting on that committee, and I was there with Daniel Fear, our the regional coordinator, who's with me now, who obviously helped who arranged that meeting as well. But just to give you the idea of what we're thinking at the moment, this situation, we need to analyse why people are actually on the Downs in the first place. Because obviously you get stories there. I even heard one last night of Range Rovers and Airbnbs in these actual vans. Again, with
caravans.
Caravans. Yeah. And then we've also got a situation where people are dealing in various drugs, etc. So there's a lot of...
Okay, well, that is almost certainly happening in the houses too, not just the caravans. There'll be some Airbnbs up in the houses, and probably some drugs too.
Absolutely. But the difference here is technically by bylaw they shouldn't be there in the first place. Now, obviously, there will be some people who may need accommodation. That, again, shows the acute housing shortage and problem there is. And going back to your initial point on this, when I speak to people on the doorsteps, again, they do not like the idea that illegal migrants go to the front of these queues for accommodation. They feel deprived of the accommodation that their children are not getting, because obviously house prices are beyond the reach of most children nowadays. So that's the problem. So I really obviously hope there is a solution to the Downs problem, but again, should they be in that particular area?
But why aren't the council? You see, this is where Reform UK is supposed to be strong nowadays. Local authorities have failed in many parts of the country. Reform UK, some people see this as really the only hope. What would you be doing if you were at Bristol City Council?
I think at the moment, obviously, if we had power in Bristol, we could actually enforce the bylaws and say, please go.
Well, all that's going to do is move people to another site, outside someone else's door.
Absolutely. But there's a lead up to that process. The first thing to find out is, why are these people there, who are they, and what are they doing to monitor that situation? And then in which case we can break down the numbers. And that number will probably decline from the current number to a lower number. Obviously, certain people shouldn't be there.
Well, what do you mean they shouldn't be there?
Well, I mean, if you've got people who are dealing in drugs, or let's say letting spaces at night, or whatever else they're trying to do there.
Well, I mean, that's surely going to be a tiny minority. Most of these people, what you're doing is you're almost like saying, well, the housing crisis doesn't exist. In Bristol, it does. It's an absolutely horrendous place to try and get somewhere to live, and it's outside London, the highest rent anywhere in the country.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's a massive problem, but I think this is such a big problem, it needs a solution on a national level, which, I mean, we look at the situation where the Bank of England has lost £130 billion of moving from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening. So just to explain, that's the process where during COVID they wanted to go ahead and buy bonds and various financial instruments from banks in order to pump money into the system, and now things are slightly better.
Sorry to interrupt you, but there was actually a financial crisis in 2019. We didn't hear much about that because COVID took over. It was a bit like 2008. The banks were saying, hey guys, we're having real big problems here. So the Bank of England is doing that probably to try and sort that, basically printing money to give to the banks to keep them going in 2019.
Yeah, well, I think the difference is, if you compare it to the States, their cost in the Federal Reserve is a third of the cost that's happened here in the UK. And the big difference, one of them, is what they have in the US is a thing called deferred assets. Now, deferred assets means that you can delay when you effectively are actually selling these bonds back into the market over a much longer period. It's not a fire sale. And as you know, if you do a fire sale, you're far more likely to get a worse price, and that's what the Bank of England has been doing, unfortunately. I'm not blaming them, but it's just they've gone in a bit harder.
Well, I've got no problem with you blaming the Bank of England for anything, actually, because I think they've done absolutely disastrous. I'm very glad we've still got our own currency.
Yeah, that's true.
But the Bank of England seems to be making a real mess of it. We had the Professor Steve Hall, a recording with him last week, and we had a clip of him last week as well, talking about the economy generally and criticising Rachel Reeves's spending plans last week. But I'd like to play a clip now from him where he talks about this Farage policy, Tice policy from Reform UK, where they're saying actually someone needs to go and bang heads together at the Bank of England and say, why are we paying £35 billion in interest a year to commercial banks? So let's just have a little listen to that now.
Well, Panmure, this is in the Daily Telegraph, Panmure Liberum, I'm not quite sure, I think they're some private investment company, they recently warned of an immediate and violent sterling crisis if Nigel Farage came to power.
There you go, the threats have started already. That's what they do. And sometimes they don't even have to do it, they just have to threaten. Because of the inflation after Truss. Truss did this, for completely different reasons. She thought she could lower taxes, use the state's money to tide people over during difficult times and woo private equity. Stupid idea. But it wasn't that angered the markets, i.e. the market traders and the central bankers who are working on the side of the market traders rather than the government, even though they're supposed to be governed by the Treasury, by the Treasury, which is part of the elected government.
Well, OK, look, Richard Tice, the party's deputy leader, sent a letter last week to Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, accusing Threadneedle Street of prioritising corporate profits over the interests of working people. He claimed the bank was engaging in a systemic misuse of taxpayers' money by paying interest and selling its existing stockpile of government bonds at substantial losses. Threadneedle Street did not start paying interest on reserves until 2006, he said.
Well, that's not quite true. All reserves or interest, it's just that the interest was very low. But he's right in saying whether he means it or not. Whether he means it. This could be just pantomime politics. This could be a stage act because they all know each other. As Farage is a former commodity broker, and Tice, of course, is a property developer. I don't know whether they're serious about this, but it's a superb and clever political move to start this antagonism with the central bank and with the money markets, because people will think at last someone out there is on our side.
OK, Steve. Well, look, what's the best way people can find and follow you? And if you could just tell us a little bit about your books. Well,
our last book, it was The Death of the Left in 2023. Well, more recent one, but it's a specialist criminological book out in this month. It was actually May the 30th. That's right. It came out May the 30th. And follow me on X, Steve Hall on X, and where I'm pontificating about economics, economic history, psychology, politics, and all the rest of it. And see if you agree with my tweets. I tweet about this sort of thing quite regularly and get quite a bit of attention. I think I'm right about this. I think that really we need to face up, face up to the reality that we're subjugated by global money markets, and we can't carry on like this. And we must take our economy under the management of our elected representatives who can work in some ways with private capital. I mean, Attlee didn't abolish capitalism, and neither did Deng Xiaoping. In fact, he brought it back in order to help China develop. But the difference between China and this country, and America, of course, and Europe, is that in China, the politicians control the bankers and the central bankers and the big corporate players. Over here, the corporate players, the bankers and the central bankers control the politicians. The relationship is the inverse. And Tice and Farage have made noises about reclaiming that power on behalf of the people. They might mean it and they might not, but either way, it's a very clever political move, and once again, they've outflanked the stupid left.
And finally, do you think maybe that they're forcing the Labour government's hand on some of these issues, like for example, the winter fuel payments? It seems that they've kind of out-lefted the left.
Well, that's a U-turn that everyone expected, because, that just makes the Labour Party appear to be vicious Calvinists. You have the likes of Rachel Reeves and Liz Kendall, who, they don't have very attractive ideas, and morally attractive ideas. They seem to have reverted to some sort of, Victorian, almost soft eugenics. And it's quite nasty, and it's turning voters away. You've seen what's happened. The Labour Party, their popularity has plummeted. So again, clever move by Reform. But the fact remains that, we need braver politicians. We need international agreement. We would suffer if only Britain stood up to their money markets. We need agreement from the Americans. And don't forget, what did Roosevelt do? One of the first things he did in 1933 was separate investment banking from the clearing banks and clip the wings of the investment bankers. It's one of the first things he did. And following that, he began to drag the US out of the depression. Corporate capitalists quite like recessions and depressions because they reboot the system, they gain assets in the fire sale, and they can start again in a few years' time making big profits out of the wreckage. They don't mind recessions at all, but recessions are awful for ordinary people. And the sort of kowtowing that the Labour Party has done to this sort of economic thinking has ruined its reputation amongst most of the population, and it will be very, very difficult to recover.
Okay, Steve Hall, thanks very much for joining us again.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, so that's Professor Steve Hall speaking to me last week, but about Reform UK, Richard, and it seems actually there's quite a lot of alignment there. Is there anything you'd like to point out about what Steve was saying?
Yeah, I'm obviously very pleased to hear that, and so obviously a subject that needs to be talked about, because there's really big money here that could deal with a lot more, big things on a massive scale. The first point I'd like to make is just on this whole thing about the sort of interest that the Bank of England pays on the reserves that the banks hold at the Bank of England. Even Sir Charlie Bean, who's till recently been the Deputy Governor, but well respected, he's not saying that he thinks there should be no interest on the reserves at all, but he's saying that the idea of reducing that interest level is a good idea. So I'm not saying that's the solution. It's not going as far as reform, but that's already showing that people within the establishment are taking this thing seriously.
So would those commercial banks lend the money to the Bank of England if they weren't getting any interest?
I think the bottom line is they may have to, because sometimes there's actually nowhere else for them to go. And one of the good things about Reform doing this, it's bringing this whole Bank of England stuff to debate. And obviously for some time I've been saying myself that another problem that exists at the moment is I think interest rates are too high for the actual situation of the economy. I mean, for example, the Institute of Economic Affairs believes that the inflation target, rather than set an arbitrary 2%, should be set at a level that is at the equivalent of the GDP spending figure, which basically includes growth plus inflation. So therefore the interest rate will be lower, because it will deem that, because at the moment inflation is deemed to be 3.4 instead of the 2% target. So interest rates are hiked up all the way to, current yield on the bonds 10-year is gilts are 4.55%. So if you're thinking that any business, small business, anyone buying a house, that's 4.55% plus whatever, extra the banks charge. So to my mind, if the Bank of England target was changed, which the Parliament here has got the power to do. Now, I'm not saying these things, that would just make a massive difference throughout the whole economy. It would create more jobs. The stock market might improve, the whole situation of lending people might be able to get mortgages more easily, so that could really help, and it's a big measure.
Well, look, Steve made that point about Liz Truss, didn't he? What do you make of that?
I mean, obviously, Liz Truss, comparing to Nigel Farage, has no business experience or no experience in the financial markets, nor did Kwasi Kwarteng at all. And the way they did it, no disrespect to them, is you don't go suddenly changing the whole policy overnight without consulting people in the city and doing it gently. She just did it almost straight away with no consultation. Anyone who knows the financial markets knows that is explosion. It's not going to work. But I think before, Nigel Farage has been in the financial markets a lot. Richard Tice has been in different ways.
Hang on, the Bank of England themselves last week was saying that if Farage tries to do this, it's going to cause instability. So he's implying a similar kind of reaction to Truss.
Well, I'm sure Andrew Bailey, the current Bank of England governor, does not want this. But if he talks to Sir Charlie Bean, who is the deputy governor, he would have there's some value in actually going ahead and at least not paying interest on part of the reserve. So at least that debate needs to be had. And I'm not necessarily saying that a reform government should do this on the first day they're in office. There needs to be a lot of soundings taken in the city and an education of it. And actually, there are people in the States who have the same view as well. I mean, it's not just in, when you look at Bloomberg TV or CNBC, it does come up from time to time. The idea, this 2% target, which they've also got in the States, is arbitrary. It's set about 2 decades ago. It doesn't have to be 2%.
Yeah, so I mean, the key thing here is that we're constantly hearing, oh, there's not enough money for this, there's not enough money for that. Actually, maybe there is, and this is a bit of a emperor's new clothes.
I do feel there is an element to that, definitely, because at the moment we're in a situation where we're banging on our heads ourselves with too harsh an interest rate regime too soon after certain financial crises. The problem is the BOE, the Bank of England, indeed the Federal Reserve, they're looking at things on a day-to-day basis. What's the market doing now? 1 month, 2 months. But, things take time to adjust in the real market. People with real decisions, real mortgages, real people, small businesses, they don't make the decision on one day. They make the decision after a few weeks or months or even 6 months, a year later.
Hang on, because Steve is making a different point, really, which is that the Bank of England and the Treasury are really working for corporate profiteers. They're not working for the voters.
I think that's an interesting area, because I'm also...
Well, they're not pushing back enough.
Yeah, I think they're not pushing back enough. And then the Bank of England's got its independence. It's going to fight tooth and nail for that right. It's going to be very, very careful not to lose that. And another problem that makes this more complicated is any losses on quantitative easing or quantitative tight, whatever, the Treasury indemnifies the Bank of England, which means whatever's done to sort out any losses or any getting the money back is going to be done too quickly, where in the States it's different. That money is not by way of indemnity, it's by way of deferred asset, which means basically got much longer to get this all sorted out.
Completely separate to this. In fact, we did this a bit earlier on with the attack on Iran by the Israelis and comparing that to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to play a clip now from Adam Curtis's new film, Shifty, which looks back to the 1980s. And this is just out. It's a I mean, I love Adam Curtis, although it's in a similar way to I like John Peel, because you listen to a John Peel programme, you'd hear 2 or 3 absolutely impossible to listen to songs, and then suddenly an absolute blinder would come round the corner. And it's exactly the same with Adam Curtis. He puts all sorts of silly, ridiculous things, like about a dog that's changing his sex, a great long interview with the lady owner of the dog, and then suddenly an absolute bombshell from the 1980s with Alan Budd, who was chief economic advisor to Margaret Thatcher, saying, well, actually, Thatcher didn't really understand anything. It was all a big illusion, and they were pulling the wool over her eyes all the way through. So anyway, let's have a listen to a little compilation now of a few interviews, including one with Alan Budd. And I'm not quite sure who else is in here. Anyway, yeah, what I'll do is I'll say probably afterwards who it is. But this is a little extract from this new film by Adam Curtis. Well worth a download, well worth a watch and listen to, or you can watch it on the iPlayer. Shifty by Adam Curtis on the BBC.
The other are the hard left, operating inside our system, conspiring to use union power and the apparatus of local government to break, defy and subvert the law. That is when we have to stand up and be counted. That is when we have to do what we believe to be right.
The nightmare I sometimes have about this whole experience runs as follows. I was involved in making a number of proposals which were partly at least adopted by the government and put in play by the government. Now, my worry is as follows, that there may have been people making the actual policy decisions, or people behind them, who never believed for a moment that this was the correct way to bring down inflation. They did, however, see that it would be a very, very good way to raise unemployment. And raising unemployment was an extremely desirable way of reducing the strength of the working classes, if you like. That what was engineered there, in Marxist terms, was a crisis of capitalism which recreated the reserve army of labour and has allowed the capitalists to make high profits ever since. Now, again, I don't say I believe that story, but when I really worry about all this, I worry whether, indeed, that was really what was going on.
Monday turned out to be a watershed. We came in not really knowing what to expect after the hurricane and everything else, and we simply stared at the screens all day, watching the sea of red, as it was known, watching financial prices falling, and realising that the British people had simply lost control over their economy. We had all been led to believe that Mrs. Thatcher was in control of events. A lot of us suspected that perhaps that was an exaggeration. It was clear that she was trying to cover up a lot of the cracks with a lot of rhetoric. We had to accept the logic of the market, which was quite simply that there was no longer any entity which we could reasonably and realistically call the Great British Economy.
Do you think she knew that?
I suspect that towards the end, with the kind of problems which emerged at the end, she began to suspect that perhaps she had been chasing an illusion, yes.
No, it's not heavy. This is all in porcelain. The quality of the work is superb. But look above all at the expression on the faces of the Marines. No gloating at all, but just unbelievable kindliness and pride, once again, in raising the flag of Britain. More than that, restoring freedom to the people of the Falklands. It is the spirit of Britain, and it is everything that makes us great.
So that's a little extract from Shifty by Adam Curtis, and so you heard there Alan Budd, who was chief economic advisor to Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, or certain part of the 1980s. He was saying, Martin, wasn't he, something very interesting. He was saying, well, there was all this talk about we've got to do this and this and this to bring down inflation. Actually, what he's saying is that the real policy was just increasing unemployment, because that benefited the city.
Well, I was aware of him saying that years ago. I think he was a monetarist economist, and he was quite a technical type person, and he really thought, when he was advising the then Conservative government, that it really was about getting inflation down. But of course he then came to the conclusion that maybe this wasn't about that. This is about a shift in the balance of power in the society against the trade unions and so on, which of course I agree with. So I mean, that was when he comes out with that, I'm going, yes, okay, I agree with you.
Always going to be necessary when you're deindustrialising. The unions are going to be the first in the firing line, aren't they? Whether they're the coal miners or whether they're the print unions, for example, at Wapping.
Well, that's true, but also, of course, it's a quite weak hand that you're playing, because if they're trying to get rid of you anyway, going on strike is a defensive manoeuvre. You can't really expect to win. And of course, that's exactly what happened with the miners' strike. There was a possibility to settle it on some terms which would have kept the industry functional, but neither side was prepared to accept those terms, and so we ended up where we ended up.
So what I'll do is I'll put a link up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk to Adam Curtis's Shifty on the iPlayer, and I think it's up on YouTube as well. Anyway, Richard, what do you make of hearing that? Because a lot of what we're hearing the last couple of weeks from Reform UK is we need a bit of reindustrialisation. We need to potentially reopen the Port Talbot Steelworks with a proper blast furnace, not some kind of electronic green thing, and also even maybe open some coal mines. So I just wonder what you make of that, what we were hearing there about the 1980s and the deindustrialisation under Thatcher.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the world has changed in many ways, obviously since what we're, let's say, looking with some of the comments just being made in terms of inflation as well. Since the 1980s, obviously the world trade flows of money in terms of trade and indeed speculative monies have actually increased a lot. And indeed, interdependence with different areas. So let's say the COVID happened, or let's say the Ukraine conflict have definite effects here on inflation in terms of oil price, etc. Things that we're more interconnected. So obviously, it's not necessarily just unemployment, base increase unemployment, deal with inflation. Inflation's got many components. But going to your particular question about the Wales situation, obviously Nigel Farage is, as you rightly say, he's not into the Tata Steel situation where they want to have a green electric furnace which will be completed in 2028. There's been £500 million put in by the government there, and the rest is coming from Tata. He's not really going for that. Nor is he going for using existing blast furnaces. He's going for a new one. Basically, that does, he admit, costs several billion. I think it's 3 billion it would cost there. But the idea of that is that it gives security to this country in terms of, obviously we're in a situation where the world is to some extent deglobalizing. We've got situations where recently Russia was previously a very big supplier of steel. One of their big companies has just stopped doing that. We've obviously got China that is flooding the market to some extent with steel as well. But if you look, it's not just that one's protecting national security. There's also an economic argument as well. If you look at the prices of steel and coal, they're very, very up and down as well. And you could have a situation where during the commodity boom in the mid-2000s, you had people like Mittal, etc., making an absolute fortune from steel anywhere in the world. Now that's not the current situation, but the idea is if you have a surplus of supply within your own economy, you can deal with the ups and downs of the market economy. One of the frailties of the market economy is it does often leave not enough supply in the system when things go wrong. So that's the supply protection as well. So in terms of that policy, he's obviously not going to, if let's say Reform do take control of the Senedd in Cardiff, they cannot do this, or it's going to be hard to do it without the national government in London. But obviously if there's a Reform government, which we hope in London as well, and also one in Cardiff, then that's something they can really look at.
Okay, well, do you want to say in layman's terms where you're going to find the money to do this? And I don't want to hear we're going to be taking it from disabled people like the Labour Party are.
Right, I thought you were going to say not from the Bank of England, so fiasco. But I think I'd answer that firstly. Obviously, we're dealing with billions of pounds in the figures I've just given in the Bank of England situation. Beyond that, Nigel Farage's argument that these people, if they're made unemployed, might be on benefits, they're going to be a cost to the economy. So if that can be in some way circulated back, it's going to work better. And as you know, with all these businesses, even with Tata, the Welsh Government is making payments to the smaller businesses that have been affected. So there's a whole load of supply chains down the economy that are going to be affected when it's going away. But conversely, when you bring back the steel production, you're going to be bringing these back in, which will create jobs and some economic vibrancy in those areas.
Martin, does that make any sense to you?
Yes. I think what's interesting about what's happening now is because the Conservative Party, because of their association with what happened in the 1980s, they're not in a position to make this argument. You are, because you're a new force. So I welcome that, but obviously from my point of view, it doesn't go far enough. Yeah, it's opening the debate up, which I welcome. And of course, what Steve Tucker would be saying is, well, we don't have to do it. We don't have.
Steve Hall?
Steve Hall, sorry. We don't have to actually. There's no relationship between selling bonds and spending money. Yeah. You don't have to actually get the money from the private sector banking system. In China, the banks ultimately are owned by the government, which means that they don't have to worry about stuff like that. And that looks to me like the wave of the future.
Steve is always pushing this thing, modern monetary theory.
Well, the modern monetary theory is very
interesting. Which is saying, very simply, I'm going to try and make it simple, which is your central bank makes up the money free of charge. You don't borrow it from a commercial bank. This is a massive mistake to do this. Am I right in saying that's
basically it? I mean, the Bank of England was nationalised in 1946. The Federal Reserve in the United States, set up in 1913, is still basically a private cartel. It's got some legal barriers around it, but the actual The central bank, not the central bankers, the commercial bankers in New York sit on the board of the New York Fed, and they determine the policy fundamentally. The Bank of England is not determined by the city because it is nationalised, but on the other hand, they definitely listen to the city and follow what they say, because that's part of their job to do that. But I think ultimately we're probably going to go into a fairly major economic crisis before the next election, and not just in this country. And we're going to have to consider all sorts of options. So it's good that we're starting to talk about them, isn't it?
Richard, what about priorities? Nigel Farage has talked about steel and coal. What other priorities to bring into some kind of public control or public ownership?
Well, reform policy at the last election, the contract was that basically you'd have utilities should be 50% owned by the government, 50% by a collection of British pension funds. Now, obviously, the big case example where reforms obviously had comments recently has been, like, we've obviously got the Thames Water situation where reform has been ahead of the Labour Party, which even now today, as you know, with these stories, as the situation gets more dire day by day, as it gets nearer to special administration of the company Thames Water, the Labour government is now increasingly talking about nationalisation, but reform was ahead of the curve on that.
Martin, are you embarrassed as a Labour Party member?
I am indeed. It's just wrong. I mean, what should have happened with Thames Water a long time ago, it should have just been put into receivership. The people who wasted money investing in it, we should actually be chasing them down because they owe us money. So what they're saying is we've got to pay £20 billion or £20 million to buy it back. And we don't have to do that. There's no reason to do that. You just put it through receivership. It's a bankruptcy procedure. That's what capitalism's about. You know, you've lost your money. Bye-bye.
So why should we pay you for this?
Why
are the Labour Party not saying these very sensible things?
Because they're getting quite a lot of their funding these days from the City of London. It used to be the trade unions, Arthur Scargill's all used to. That's no longer the case. No.
Anyway,
course,
sorry, I interrupt.
And of course, that will obviously be a problem for a reform government because some of your funding will be coming from people like this, and they're going to have their views about what you do.
So I didn't. I tried to interrupt you, Richard, but you were just starting to talk about some of the things which maybe a reform central government would be able to actually intervene, and maybe utilities and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so we've got utilities. Obviously, reform were pretty early when Richard Tice was wearing a badge in the Commons supporting the situation in the Scunthorpe steelworks, which is formerly owned by a Chinese company, now British Steel under the realms of the government. Now, that has gone into a nationalisation situation, but again, reform was ahead of the Labour Party on that as well. So that shows that's the sort of look of reform government you're looking at in the future, where it will intervene in certain areas that haven't been intervened for some time.
So what about gas, electricity, railways? There's quite a long list of possibilities. Actually, the railways seem to be tumbling back into public ownership all of their own accord.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously you've got lots of things in the rail industry, and obviously people still look at that should end up being nationalised. But again, reform's current policies so far is that it should be 50% owned by the state, 50% by the private sector. But let's say we end up with a situation where it's similar to the situation, let's say, in Scunthorpe with British Steel stroke the Chinese firm that owned it, and indeed we go over to Port Talbot or in Thames Water. It shows where necessary reform will move quickly and act quickly. And one thing just to say about the reform people that would be doing this, they're less bureaucratic than the previous governments in the way they would act. They would go ahead quickly, and they're used to doing things quickly, whereas people who've been in power for a long time tend to move a bit slower.
Okay, finally, can you just talk a bit about foreign policy? Because anyone who's trying to make waves in national government, which reform is certainly in a position, you know, if there was an election tomorrow, to do that. What's your position on the two big conflicts in the world at the moment? That's one in the Middle East with Israel and Gaza, which is the main one, although we've got another one that seems to have started up over the last week or so with Iran. And also, of course, between Ukraine and Russia. I remember noting with some amusement that Nigel Farage had said, well, actually it was NATO that provoked the Russians to invade Ukraine. So what's your position on those two?
Well, I think reform's position is obviously every country has the right to defend itself, whether it's Ukraine or Israel. In the situation where you've got this conflict in Palestine, for example, in Gaza, it's obviously not good. It's terrible what's happening in there as well. You've got a situation where Ukraine is a dangerous situation, but one of the things they did say in the contract is sometimes you do have to work with regimes that you don't necessarily agree with their policies in order to further peace. So if I was betting on peace, I'd rather be betting on someone like Nigel Farage than someone in the situation of the Labour Party or some of these other parties that seem to find it a bit more easier to drift into conflicts.
Well, no, I want to hear a bit more from you, please, about what you what you think the rights and wrongs are in those two conflicts. I mean, it's very easy to say we're going to sit down and talk peace, but how? How would you? Whose fingers need to be held to the fire to get the peace that we all want?
Yeah, I think basically some of it's about how you get on with people and how you work with people. I mean, Putin, my guess is more likely to do a deal with someone like Trump than, let's say, Biden, just in terms of the way that the chemistry of the two people. With Reform, obviously, Nigel Farage isn't Prime Minister at the moment. Hopefully he will be, and a lot believe he will be soon. So that's got to be tested. On a private view, obviously, I've got 3 young sons. I don't want them to be conscripted into some war in Ukraine or something like that. And I think it's absolutely terrible. At the end of the day, we are up against a nuclear power, which is Russia, and we've got to bear that in mind.
But that's okay. We're a nuclear power too, apparently.
Yeah, well, that's but that's the whole thing, isn't it? Because once you're into this sort of stalemate, and it's a very, very difficult situation. But let's look at where we are in the world right now. If a peace had been agreed back in 2022 after February, relatively soon, Putin was offering the part of the enclaves in the Donetsk region and Luhansk. And obviously Crimea and some protections for Russians in the Ukraine area. Now the deal on the table is if it does happen, is going to be far worse. So all I'm saying is this conflict with all the horrific suffering that's happened in Ukraine, Russia, and indeed in the wider world, when we're talking about the economy and all the jobs that have been affected, inflation throughout the world, the high oil price that ensued afterwards, and the COVID shock doubled by the Ukraine shock. It just shows by continuing with these conflicts in that way is not necessarily the solution.
Well, look, after the break, we're going to be hearing direct from northern Gaza, which not many people are able to do, but we will. So what do you make of that conflict? We've seen over the last week or so this horrific shooting of people who are coming to try and get aid. Killing of something like 70 people a night have been being killed as they try and get aid, shot dead by the Israeli army.
That's horrifically sad that's happened, and obviously these sort of situations happen. Obviously, I don't know that much about this particular situation to make a judgment as to why or how or who's responsible and who's at fault.
Well, they're Israeli guns and Israeli soldiers, and they're Palestinians who are dying and hungry and starving.
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen that, but let's assume that I haven't seen that particular case. But let's assume that is a case. That's horrific and shouldn't happen. I mean, then they're unarmed civilians dealing with an invading force, and obviously Israel needs to be careful in that situation in terms of the way it's seen by the world, not to be too hard on people in that situation.
Okay, Richard, if people are interested in Reform UK here in Bristol or other parts of the country, can you just give us an idea of, I don't want to hear you can go to this website. Do you actually meet in person, or can people actually go and see Reform?
Yeah.
Should we say ring flesh and actually talk and have a pint with Reform people?
Absolutely, yeah. We have a meet-up every month, sometimes twice a month and sometimes even more. And we have them in different pubs in throughout Bristol.
Oh, that's just here in Bristol, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
right.
So we do that, and we welcome people there, and there's no money to be paid, and people get on really well, and there's a bit of a community emerging of people getting to know each other. The good thing is people can have a good discussion about politics. They're not formal, and people love having a good natter, and they get on really well with each other. So very, very encouraging.
Okay, and in other parts of the country, similar?
Yeah, similar, absolutely. They're growing there as well, and it's throughout the whole country, really, so that's going very well.
What sort of say? I mean, I'm not saying that Labour Party members like Martin here get much of a say in Labour policy. Do the members get any say in what Reform does?
With Reform? We get obviously we get no say in what Reform.
no. But you don't get any say in what Labour do. But anyway, what about Reform, Richard, finally?
Well, in Reform, I mean, we do get say in the sense that obviously if things are, let's say, passed on to me, I'll try and pass them on higher up. At the moment, we've got a branch structure that's emerging throughout the country. We've got quite a lot of branches emerging. And the way things will work is branch will feed into who the candidates are, let's say for council elections and general elections, which in a sense will be feeding into the general mandate of the government in Westminster and indeed in local councils.
And what about so many people that just say, oh, Farage is just a racist?
I've met Farage a few times, and I honestly don't think he's racist at all. I mean, literally, there's so many people, both within Reform and outside, who are either I'm got foreign blood myself. I've travelled all over the world. I've got Muslim friends, and I put myself in a category with most Reform people. They're not looking at being racist at all. It's really, the problem is they're just saying we've just had enough of what's happened in an economy where it's just not delivering, and they just think there's just too many illegal migrants.
Okay, Richard Visick from Bristol Reform UK, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.